Well, good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to tonight's presentation. My name is Charlene Margot. I am co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are delighted to have you with us tonight and very grateful to our special presenter, Dr. Donald Grant. We would also like to say thank you tonight to our sponsors, the Redwood City School District, Sequoia Healthcare District, Peninsula Healthcare District, Sequoia Union High School District, and this organization, The Parent Venture. We would not be here without your support and sponsorship, so thank you very much. This is a really important and timely event. I don't think I need to tell you that. With several hundred of you registered, we know that this is a topic that is much on parents' minds, and we're just so glad to have you with us tonight. I'm sure by now most of you are familiar with the Zoom format, but just a reminder that this is a webinar. So there are two ways for you, the attendees, to interact with us. One is the chat button. So please put any logistical questions for us, the panelists, in there. As I mentioned, my partner Bev will be putting in resource links, so check that out. For questions, and if you have questions either during the presentation or at the end, we will allow time for Q&A. Please put those into the Q&A box. So comments and resource links in the chat, questions in the Q&A. This event is going to be recorded and will be available soon on our video library. We are grateful to Sequoia Healthcare District and the Boys and Girls Club of the Peninsula for sponsorship and videography. There will be a very short survey also in the chat at the end of the night. We hope you'll take 2 minutes to fill out those 4 questions. All right, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's featured presenter. Dr. Donald E. Grant Jr. is a trusted thought partner to teams and organizations around the globe. He's the executive director of Mindful Training Solutions, a boutique training and consulting firm, and the former founding executive of the Center for Community and Social Impact at Pacific Oaks College. He holds a doctoral degree in clinical psychology, a bachelor's degree in biology, and a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner's certificate. Dr. Grant is also an international workshop facilitator, a film TV consultant, and the published author of A Moon for Us All, a family narrative for young readers and their families, and Black Men, Intergenerational Trauma and Behavioral Health, A Noose Across Nations, published in 2019. As always, we are delighted to have Dr. Grant with us. So Donald, please take it away. We can't wait to hear what you have to say this evening. Oh, and just finally, for anyone who is unfamiliar, the title of tonight's event is Seeing Race, Talking with Your Kids About Ethnicity, Culture, and Inclusion. Dr. Grant, take it from here.
Thank you so much, Charlene. Such a pleasure to be with you all today. And what a great opportunity to have such an important conversation. I love that the genesis of this work is coming from people who are dedicated and really aiming their work and efforts to ensure that both parents, family, not both, but that parents, families, educators, and the whole system that's aimed at supporting children gets what they need. And hopefully you'll find this hour that we spend together today valuable in this presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So as stated, today our topic of conversation is looking at how do we see race? How do we talk about it with our kids? How do we talk about ethnicity? How do we talk about inclusion? How do we have these really tough conversations? And today, my hope is that we'll be able to structure this in a way that allows people to leave with some tools and some spaces where they feel like they're able to really access things that they may have not been able to access before, things that may have been challenging before, but also things that they may find that they have strength and skills in that they didn't know before. And so we'll move through some slides. And as we said, as Charlene stated, we'll have an opportunity for Q&A when we end. One of the things that I do is I start every presentation that I engage with. I started off with the construct of mindfulness, understanding that when we tend to judge ourselves, excuse me, my lighting's not as good as I thought it was. When we tend to judge ourselves and aim in these ways, we lose sight of some of the major goals that sit inside of our space. And so when we think about what mindful practices are, they're not just this kind of en vogue term that people are using to discuss meditation and things like that. What it really is a research-based construct that says, I'm going to have this experience and I'm not going to judge myself about it. I'm going to explore the experience. I'm going to learn about myself, but I'm not going to judge myself, because when we judge ourselves, we bring shame and guilt into the conversation, and that stops the learning, that stops the unlearning, that stops the opportunities for us to really get it right for the things that we want to do. And when we're talking about our children and the future of this land for them, it's important that we work really hard to get this right. So my hope is that as we move through the presentation today, you all will practice some mindfulness. You'll think about those things that make you feel anxious, or that make you feel vindicated, or that make you feel afraid to move forward. But you're not going to judge yourself for those things. You're going to accept that that's an experience that you're having, and you're going to learn from it. Because remember, when we judge ourselves, we bring shame and guilt into the picture, and that is not a productive space to be in. So why is it hard to talk about race? Everybody understands that one of the hardest things to talk about right now, particularly given what we're seeing in the world, is having conversations about race. Well, one of the things that makes it hard to talk about race is the fact that racism exists. And it's hard to even think that we continue to live in a world where oppression and depression and all these things are still so prevalent. But racism is one of those things. So that's one of the things that makes it hard to talk about racism. The other thing is that racism creates a quandary. There's research that tells us that race is not real. Race doesn't have any scientific foundation. So if we got a group of people together of all different races and ethnicities, and we try to determine their race simply based on biological samples like blood and urine and saliva, we wouldn't necessarily be able to tell the difference. There aren't a lot of biological foundations to dictate the differences between the races, which is why some people say race is not real. Here's the problem with that quandary, is that even though race is not real, people say it doesn't matter. But when you think about so many situations and scenarios, we have to understand that race is real and it does matter. The other quandary is race is not real, but it matters. Yet we have all these examples that demonstrate the outcomes surrounding race and shows us that there are so many real parts about race, even though we're unable to scientifically prove that there's a race gene or that there's racial differences that are significant between groups of people. One of the things that we have to understand about this quandary, whether race is real and it doesn't matter, or race is not real and it matters, is that it's a both and. Race is real and it matters. And we have to talk about it. We can't continue to behave in a way as though it's not real. So here's why it's hard to talk about race, besides the quandary. The first thing is this concept called cognitive dissonance, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The second thing is this concept of how our brain works, that we use these things called heuristics, and we'll talk more about that. The next thing is bias. And many of you have been talking about bias in different areas. Some of you are discussing bias in your workplace. Some of you are discussing bias in the schools that your children go to. Some of you are discussing bias in your family and just really learning about it and unpacking it. So we'll unpack that a little bit more as well. So cognitive dissonance. This is why people get upset when their beliefs are challenged, because cognitive dissonance says, I have these two competing thoughts at the exact same time, and I am not sure what to do with them because they both can't be true at the same time. And it's this conflict that comes about. Now, what research has shown us is that in the space of cognitive dissonance, people make one of two decisions. They either change their behaviors or they change the truth. The question is, when we prepare to engage in intimate, close discussions about race and racism, we have to pay attention to the fact that cognitive dissonance exists. We have to pay attention to the fact that when we think about the ways in which some of us move around the world, which are pleasant and kind and engaging and pro-social, it's hard for us to believe that there is a whole section of the world that don't engage in that way, that see other people as hostile, as dangerous. And how do we reconcile that? Well, one of the things that we've been doing is we've been changing the truth. We've been convincing ourselves, oh, it's not as bad as it is. Racism, sexism, homophobia, it can't be as horrible as people are saying it is. But these communities continue to tell us that it is. And so instead of consistently changing the truth, which is one of the outcomes of cognitive dissonance, we have to begin to change our behaviors. We have to begin to behave and act in a way whereby we understand that these systems of oppression are real and that they're strong and that most importantly, they're injuring people. And so when we learn about cognitive dissonance and we learn more pro-social ways to break the tension associated with cognitive dissonance, then we're able to move forward in a healthy way. Then we're able to say, okay, I understand that things are as bad as they are, but that doesn't necessarily make me a bad person. It just requires me to increase my awareness. It requires me to understand something different about the world, that I am no longer able to redefine what someone else's truth is. The other thing I mentioned were heuristics. Heuristics are these mental shortcuts that tend to ease the cognitive decision-making load that we have. And so our brains are structured whereby humans are considered what we call cognitive misers. A cognitive miser is somebody who uses the least, not somebody, an organism, who attempts to utilize the least amount of cognitive energy to solve any problem. Many human beings operate in this way because it's the way our brains are structured. And so you see all these door exit devices on this slide. And when you think about cognitive dissonance, it functions in a way that says, okay, few of these doorknobs or door exit devices look exactly like the ones that are in the room that you are in right now. Yet, when you approach all of these door exit devices, you don't stand there wondering, how do I get out of this room? I guess I'm stuck. You don't go to Target and say, I guess I can't leave Target because none of these door exit devices look like the ones that I'm familiar with. You manipulate the door exit device and you depart. That's because our brains create this mental shortcut, this box called heuristics. And in that box, we have things that fit into similar categories so that we don't have to use cognitive energy to the degree to learn something new every single time. Imagine if you had to learn each of these door exit devices every time you approach them. Now, for some of us, the hardest part of leaving a room is whether you push or pull the door. But for door exit devices, we've created these boxes, these shortcuts, so our brain doesn't have to do as much work. The concern, though, is that with these same problem-solving techniques, these same cognitive reserves techniques that we use, they apply to human beings and people too. And so we create these same shortcuts as it relates to engaging with human beings. And so when we think about the stereotypes and all those things that we have about people, these heuristics come in, again, making it difficult to talk about race because we've created boxes for people. Whereas Arab Americans are this way, Latinx and Hispanic Americans are this way, white Americans are this way, Black Americans are this way, Asian Americans are this way. In order to really have in-depth, intimate discussions about race, we have to begin to unpack those boxes, understanding that all these communities are very heterogeneous. None of them are all the same within. The next piece we mentioned was bias. And these heuristics lead to unconscious bias, or the social stereotypes about groups of people that individuals form outside their own conscious awareness. We all hold unconscious beliefs about people. If you have a brain, you have a bias. I'll say that again. If you have a brain, you have a bias. And one of the things that we have to understand is that foundationally in having these discussions, we're entering them in a biased way. And we have to honestly understand that and pay attention to it. Scientists show us that there are over 150 different biases. There are biases about name, about race, about weight, about gender, about affectional orientation or sexual orientation, about age, marital status, accents, the places where you were born. All these things hold biases. Everybody has them. We just need people to acknowledge that they're there as we make decisions for the world, as we make decisions on how we want to teach our children, how we want to engage our children. Bias is a prejudice in favor or against a thing, person, or group when compared with another group. These biases may be held by individuals, groups, or institutions. And again, heuristics are our brains use heuristics to create biases based on information. This information comes from social situations, attitudes, culture, stereotypes, a whole array, a whole host of different things, but they fit together. Don't try to fight the fact that they exist. We can't. It's the way our neurological system is set up to create these shortcuts. Now, when we move into the bias, there are these components that make it up. And this is how we have to approach dismantling these biases. They're an attitude that comes in three different parts: the affect, the feeling, the behavior, the doing, and the cognitive, the thinking. So the affect are feelings or emotions that an object, event, encounter, or experience evoke. Oftentimes, we try to tell ourselves and convince ourselves that we're neutral about a situation. Well, if anybody is able to see through that, it's our children. They understand when we're coming in with bias. They may not be able to name it, but they certainly feel it in the presentation. Many of us walk into these discussions stumbling and really concerned that we're going to say the wrong thing. And guess what? You probably will. And that's okay, because none of us really have this right. So when you think about the feelings that you have, what we want to do is we want to approach those feelings with honesty and say, you know what? Every time I go into this particular restaurant or this particular community or this particular area, I have a feeling of fear or comfort or whatever it is. We have to begin being honest about those things. Otherwise, they spew out of our ears and our eyes and our nose, and we don't know that they're happening. And suddenly we're sending messages that we did not intend to send. The next thing is the behavior, the tendency or disposition to act in certain ways toward an object, an event, or an encounter or an experience. What we know is that people all across the world have talked about engaging and feeling different behavioral things come from different people, even if you don't know you're doing it. There was a research study done years ago that spoke about therapists working with members of the LGBTQ plus community. And they were able to literally measure the distance that these therapists placed their chairs from these gay clients to determine levels of unspoken, unconscious homophobia that the therapists had no idea that they were engaging. If we don't explore these things, we have no idea that we need to pay attention to them and that they are there and that they're a big deal. Finally, cognitive, the thoughts, beliefs, and ideas we have about an object, event, encounter, or experience. If we don't approach the entire attitude of bias, we're going to continue to injure our children and send messages to them that we're not intending to send because we think we have it all together, but we really haven't done the work. Many of us need to do the work in order to have these conversations with our children appropriately. When you think about where these things sit, when you think about how these attitudes live, it's the iceberg analogy. We only see a part of what actually creates these biases. We see the behaviors and we see the result of those behaviors. What we don't see, though, are the attitudes, values, and beliefs. Those are up to us to make decisions on. Are you able to change your values or your belief systems if you're holding on to something that was given to you about a group of people that you don't find true anymore, but it's tough to fix? How do you expect to talk to your children about the LGBTQ plus community or about equity for women or about equity for Black and brown people or about the concerns and the massacres with our indigenous people? if you're not paying attention to where your attitudes, values, and beliefs sit. So what I wanted to do really quickly before we kind of get into some more toolbox things is I wanted to level set on definitions, because many of us, when we attempt to have these conversations about race and racism, we use a lot of words interchangeably, and we don't necessarily understand that there are differences between these words. So the first thing I wanted to do was to really dismantle these different definitions, the thought of a stereotype, prejudice, discrimination, and then racism. Stereotypes are these internal thoughts that we have that are given to us by a wide array of different vehicles, whether it's media, whether it's our family, whether it's our communities, whether it's the magazines and books we read, or the websites we frequent. We're given information very early on that gives us ideas about certain groups of people. And remember, we just talked about heuristics. Heuristics are the foundation of bias and stereotypes. They create these boxes that say, okay, this particular person, people tell me they're dangerous. Now, cognitively, I know there are thousands and millions of people who look like this person, but because my brain works in a way that creates heuristics, I'm just going to drop everybody into that bucket and make them all dangerous until I find out otherwise through personal experience. That's the danger of how our brains work, and that's what creates the stereotypes. And we have to pay attention to dismantling these stereotypes, these thoughts that we have, by countering them with information. Now, when that thought grows into a feeling, that feeling is called prejudice. And so you may have a stereotype about a particular group and they may be considered dangerous. So let's say for our Arab American community members, many people have been convinced through stereotypes and through consistent messaging that this group en masse is a general group, is a generally bad, dangerous group of people. Now, what that creates is an internal feeling of fear. When you see members of that community in airports, or you see members of that community in different spaces, fear comes up. That's prejudice. That's a feeling that you're getting based on stereotypes that have been fed to you about how you should engage with the world. And again, our brains are structured to work that way, so we have to be deliberate at stopping it from doing that. Because these feelings, these prejudices, they then grow into behaviors. And when the prejudicial behaviors live out in the world, we call that discrimination. And that becomes dangerous for everybody when our behaviors are dictated by these prejudices and these feelings that we have. Now, when you take discrimination and you drop it into a system of power, it becomes the ism. So when you take discrimination of women and drop it into our American system of sexism and our American system of male privilege, you get sexism. When you take xenophobia, when you take hate against immigrants and you drop it into our Americentric focus, you get xenophobia, Islamophobia, racism, classism, sexism. When you drop all these things into these systems of power, that's what you get. And there's no way that we can have honest conversations with our children if we don't understand these differences. Now, when we talk about stereotypes, one of the things that we know is that every group has stereotypes, but there's some stereotypes that we think are positive stereotypes. And one of the ones that I always use to help us understand that there are no positive stereotypes is this modern model minority myth. The model minority myth, which holds that all Asian Americans are polite, law-abiding academic prodigies who overcame discrimination, was constructed by opponents of the civil rights movement to undermine people fighting for justice and equality. The myth's purpose is to disparage the struggles of Black and Brown Americans by denying the influence of racial segregation on economic opportunities. When we talk about stereotypes and we think about the damage that they just don't do damage to the community to whom the stereotype applies. They do damage to everyone because it creates this framework of divisiveness amongst different groups of color, different groups of abilities. And what we want to do is we want to break that down. One of the things to do that is to help people understand that these myths need to be dismantled. So demystifying the model minority myth states that overall Asian Americans are better educated than the general US population, but there are large disparities. And when we look at this group as a monolith, not as a heterogeneous community, we create danger. In fact, research shows us that for the first time ever, many young Asian American college students learn for the very first time that they have a learning difference when they're in college. Because this stereotype stops a community from having this conversation, stops a family from having this conversation, and this kid has been attempting to live up to this stereotypic expectation for their entire lives. And then suddenly they learn that it wasn't them. It was the way that their brain worked in a different way that made learning different from them. But because this stereotype was so prevalent, nobody talked about that in their homes. And so when we think about stereotypes, we have to work hard to ensure that we're separating them and dismantling them and understanding them. And most importantly, not promoting them, because so many of us do, either intentionally or unintentionally. I see we have a question in the chat box, Charlene. I'm just going to check it. Is it appropriate to use race as a science term? Well, it depends on what you mean by race as a science term. As we mentioned earlier, race does not have any high degrees of evidence showing that a white person, a Black person, an Asian American person, a Latinx, Hispanic person have these huge differences biologically as it relates to our racial heritages, right? Obviously, there are some nuances there, but for the most part, our genetic codes are way more similar than they are different. Now, here's the caveat to that. If we're talking about science, whether we're talking about biological sciences or social sciences, outcomes for race actually show real results, whereby when we think about the infant mortality rates for some communities, Black babies are dying way more frequently than other babies with the infant mortality rate. And this is not due to not having insurance or no prenatal care. This is, wealthy, insured Black women having babies compared to wealthy, insured white women, and stratified across the way. And so I give that example to say that even though we can make determinations that demonstrate that race does not have a biological foundation, what we do see is we see outcomes that are racially grounded and racially based that do hold weight in science. We have to be careful with that particular type of data, though, but I do think that we do need to pay attention to race as a scientific construct, even if we are unable to ever demonstrate that it has a scientific basis. There's a lot of science in what we see with the outcomes, whether you're doing sociological studies, scientific studies related to biology, endocrinology, all these things show us things. And so I think the answer to that question is a both and, that we cannot define race based on many of the scientific hypotheses we've had to use to define other things. But because of the hard results that we see based in race, we can't ignore it in the sciences. We have to continue to talk about it. I sit as volunteer faculty at the University of Buffalo Medical School, and I open up the university's new medical students matriculation with a discussion on how race influences medicine and how it's important that they learn and pay attention to that throughout their entire time in medical school. So what do you need to do to talk to your kids about race? What do you need to know? What do you need to do? What are these next steps in order to make that happen? Well, one of the first things, in addition to the things I talked about for you to go through with your brain and understanding how the world works and creating this kind of foundational expertise on what we have to do to unlearn in order to advance this work, there's some foundational facts that we have to pay attention to. And if you're not yet at a stage in your own development where you're able to accept these things as fact, there's time to do more research. Because what I know is that the presentation of this work is all grounded in evidence. And so if there's things that you question in this part, I'd encourage you, if you really want to get it right on sharing with your kids these discussions on race, I encourage you to dig into some of these. So one of the first things is recognizing that historical revisionism and negationism is a thing. Right now, we see people attempting to ban books from different school districts. And these books are objective factual research studies and objective narratives or subjective narratives from someone's actual lived experience. Yet we're saying we can't have that information in the books. Now, when we talk about revisionism and negationism, we're literally saying it's the distortion of the historical record such that certain events appear to have occurred and or impacted history in a way that is in drastic disagreement with the historical record or with the consensus of people. It's usually meant to advance a socio-political view or agenda. You see here in this particular slide, I have an example of Christopher Columbus and the story of Columbus in both what we call a colonized version and a decolonized version. A colonized version is where historical revisionism or negationism has been utilized to mystify the story into something that it wasn't. When we understand where these kind of redactions are in this story, where it says in 1492, Christopher Columbus met Native Americans. Some of the natives returned with Columbus to Spain and lived there. The rest remained in America, the end. That's what many of us learned in school. And now our children are coming home and are learning this decolonized version. In 1492, Christopher Columbus met, raped, and slaughtered countless Native Americans. Some of these natives returned with Columbus to Spain against their will and lived there as slaves. The rest remained in America and died of smallpox and syphilis. Now, it's hard for us to imagine that the stories and the information many of us were given as youth was so deliberately redacted and flawed. But we have to own the fact that a lot of our history has been restructured in order to maintain a particular viewpoint, a particular value system. Now, some of us think that this is ancient history, but what we know is that there are still textbooks being published today. This textbook was spoken about in this article back in 2016. In this one textbook about Mexican-American heritage, there were 68 factual errors, 42 interpretive errors, 31 omission errors, multiple references to Mexicans as lazy compared to European or American workers, and Mexican-Americans spoken as Chicanos adopted a revolutionary narrative that opposed Western civilization and wanted to destroy the US society. Anybody who's ever studied anything about the Chicano movement understands that they were looking for equity. They were fighting for Mexican Americans to have a footing. In this particular one, in this particular textbook, they placed the section on slavery inside the immigration section, calling enslaved people workers. Again, these are efforts to tell a story or a narrative that's not exactly what it was. And finally, this was a homework assignment in San Antonio that asked children to give a balanced view of slavery. What were the positive aspects of slavery? This, again, is an attempt to revise, reimagine, and lie about history for a particular purpose. If you want to be able to talk to your children about race, you're going to have to be able to examine the books you choose to have in your home, the artwork you choose to have in your home, to make determinations on whether or not it is promoting, a viewpoint that works to maintain all these systems that we're talking about, that looks to maintain revisionism and negationism in these ways. Now, the next thing that we need to understand is that there's this thing called privilege that a lot of people are really afraid to talk about. When we talk about race, the privilege that we discuss is a very specific one, like when we talk about religion. Christian privilege is a thing. Those of us who identify as Christian, we were able to walk through the malls and the shopping centers last week and just see all of this evidence of our religion as we celebrated Easter. I didn't see anything recently about Ramadan or Passover in our local shopping centers. That's Christian privilege. And so as we move into a space where people really want to be honest about talking about race, we have to understand in that framework that there's a construct called white privilege. For some of us, we're practicing our mindfulness skills right now, thinking like, oh my gosh, that's such a hard thing to hear. I can't believe we brought that up. If you want to have an honest conversation about children about race with children at any developmental stage, I'm talking children 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old, up into adolescence. Research shows us that children begin to make decisions based on race, culture, and phenotype as early as the age of 4 and 5. There's a great research study called The First R of Racism, and it explores preschool children's encounters with making racial decisions and racialized decisions. White privilege is unearned advantage based on race, which can be observed both systematically and individually. If we want to have honest conversations about race and racism, we have to have honest conversations about privilege in the same way that dads and moms are talking to their daughters about the dangerous environments that men have created for them to move around in. That's due to the oppressive forces of male privilege. We've created an environment that's dangerous for women because of our privilege. And men have begun to acknowledge that here and there. If we want to talk about race, we have to talk about privilege. And in the racial dynamic, white privilege is a thing. And it's a thing that we have to be brave enough to talk about. Now, when we have that conversation, a lot of times white people are explaining the fact that there is no culture surrounding whiteness and that whiteness is just really people of European descent. But one of the things that we don't talk about, which is a part of the privilege of whiteness, is how did European immigrants even become white? And when we talk about racism, we oftentimes talk about Black people and brown people and indigenous people. When I say brown people, I'm including our Latinx and Hispanic communities, our Asian American communities, our Arab American communities. But what we don't talk about is the culture of whiteness. What people have to realize is that when European immigrants began to arrive in this land, they weren't white. They were Irish, they were Polish, they were German, they were Jewish. They were all different. They were all differently identified, based on where the country of origin. It would happen that many of these European immigrants became white as they began to gain the benefits of privilege. So someone would say, hey, Mr. Polish immigrant, if you take the SKI off of your last name, I'll let you apply for a job at my workplace. Hey, Mr. Italian immigrant, if you stop cooking all that garlicky pungent food, I'll let you buy a house on my block. And slowly but surely, these things begin to happen. If we want to have honest conversations about race with our children, these unspoken things that we kind of sweep under the rug, we have to talk about them. We can no longer ignore that they are a thing. That leads us into becoming accomplices in this work. There are 3 levels to engagement, one being an actor that doesn't have a lot of impact on anything, more like a spectator at a game. The next one is being an ally, which many of us identify ourselves as. Oh, we create these actions, we go to marches and we hold signs, and we wisely disrupt spaces. The next stage, however, is being an accomplice and a co-conspirator. You can't talk about race without talking about the injustice associated with race. You can't talk about the injustices associated with race unless you're taking an honest look at what we can do to dismantle all those oppressive forces. And what that looks like is moving into your space as an accomplice, as a co-conspirator, no longer being willing to be a bystander in any of this. What that means is going through these steps of repairing the harm, of different components of racism, following intersectionality and understanding what's happening with different groups. When we look right now at the numbers of Black trans women that are dying in American streets, when we look at the numbers of Latinx and Hispanic people with different abilities that are being mistreated and harmed, we got to begin paying attention to this stuff. It's critical. Now, when we talk about being an ally, I'm wondering, those of you who are watching today, is anybody able to notice something in this photograph? You can put it in the chat box if you want to. I'll wait a second before I tell you what I see. But does anybody see anything inside this particular photograph that looks a little bit like somebody who may be being an accomplice? There's a woman, okay. I see people saying there's a woman, yeah. But that woman, she's there, but is she participating? Ah, there we go. The man not saluting. Look at this. This is August Landmesser. He decided, because he had this marriage, this relationship, this baby with this woman who he loved, who happened to be Jewish. This was at a kind of send-off for a ship, and Hitler was there. This man decided that he was no longer able to just go with the flow of what everyone was doing. Here he stands risking a lot by not participating in this particular activity. What will you do to demonstrate to your children that you're supportive of equity? How do they see that living every day in your world? You want to talk to them about race, you have to show them what it is that you're willing to do, what sacrifices you're willing to make in order to create and produce and enhance equity. So the process to address this is right here. You start with yourself, as we've been talking this whole time. Many of you came here to get a toolbox of things to say to children. One of the most important things you can do is begin to unpack your own stuff about racism, because many of us have never existed in a space where we've been afforded the opportunity to talk openly about race, about culture, about ethnicity. The next stage is you have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. How do you build those muscles to get that comfort to be uncomfortable? Because so many of us have been convinced that we deserve to be comforted all the time. Well, that's not true. Sometimes it's valuable to be uncomfortable, because that's where some of our most important growth comes from. How to talk about racism. You got to learn it. You got to practice it. You got to engage it. You got to read books, listen to podcasts, watch documentaries to build those skills. Become anti-racist, what it is to take action and confront and reject racism. How do you practice allyship? How do you keep focused on the change? We mentioned white privilege earlier, and those of you who need some more insight on white privilege, I'd encourage you to look up Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking the Invisible Backpack. In this article, she lists about 35 to 40 different ways in which privilege exists. Again, if we want to talk about racism and race, we have to talk about privilege. This number 26 has always been one of my favorites. I can choose blemish cover or bandages in flesh color and have them more or less match my skin. It's one of my favorites because it's such a superficial, observable piece of privilege. And now Band-Aids come in different colors. When we talk about race, so many people don't even realize, down to the foundation of ACE bandages and Band-Aids, these things play out. These things play a role. This work is for everybody to do, for everybody to understand. There's not one culture group who should not be invested in talking about race and racism. It's critical. Being nice is not going to end racism. It is not sufficient. It will not get us to where we need to be. So finally, here are 7 tools that you all can utilize as we move to the question and answer period. Practice discussing racism and other types of oppression with your loved ones or others you trust. You won't always get it right, but you can learn together. Immerse yourself in another culture, i.e., attend another cultural group's religious services. Go to an event where a culture is celebrating some sort of event or activity and just immerse yourself there. Don't attempt to take over or explain it, just go and engage. Learn to identify how you experience the benefits and or burdens of structural racism. How do you gain or lose from these things that exist? And how are you being honest with yourself? Listen to the experiences of people who are different from you and explain why their perspective is important to them, even if you don't agree. Act in ways that show your loved ones that you are unwilling to tolerate systems of oppression in any form. Racism, classism, sexism. There have been years where parents, we've literally allowed our kids to witness us be bystanders. We've sat at dinner tables and allowed different people in our families to say things that were homophobic or sexist or racist, and we didn't do anything about it. We may have gotten in the car later and told our kids, you know, Uncle Johnny is just a little crazy there. Don't listen to him. But the fact that we just let that fly in the moment, that's a message to our children. Read books and articles that deepen your knowledge on perspectives different than your own that are written by people represented in the work. This is oftentimes referred to as first voice efforts, meaning that if you're reading a story about members of the Latinx or Hispanic community, try to make sure the author is from that community. Finally, support organizations owned by marginalized groups, people of color, women, members of the LGBTQIA+ community. Engage in that deliberately. Those are the things that allow us to engage in discussions about racism and race with our children. We have about 10 minutes left for Q&A, and I'm hoping that you all found this opportunity and this insight valuable for us to grow together and for us to learn together. Hey, Charlene.
Hi, Donald. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to try to see if I can find this one comment from somebody because I just really wanted to share it with folks. Here we go. This is somebody who had to leave the meeting early, but she said, I just want to express my gratitude for how this is all laid out. So often I want to have conversations with people about race, and it's hard to organize my thoughts and know the steps to take. So helpful. Thank you. I will continue to follow Dr. Grant's work. I think, Donald, your honesty is so refreshing, not always easy, but it's why we're here. So thank you for this.
It is, Charlene, and the work is just so important. Our children are so important, and you know, many of us who are now at whatever age we are, we won't necessarily go there. We weren't given the opportunity. Our parents weren't taught to dismantle these systems, and so we now have an opportunity to give something, this gift to our children to help them get it right for their children.
And I appreciate that you said at the onset that we are going to make mistakes in these conversations, but that's okay, right?
Okay, that's okay. We are 100% of the time. We're not going to get it right every time.
All right, so let's throw a few questions at you, Dr. Grant. What should a parent do if we hear our kids or one of their friends using offensive or derogatory language? You just said, don't just be quiet, but what do we do?
We want to jump in immediately. And so, you know, I oftentimes give the example with older people. some of whom have not yet learned that we don't use the word Oriental, for instance, to describe Asian Americans. And, those of you who are not clear on that yet, we can use the word Oriental to describe tapestries and things like that, but not about people. And so you may have an elderly member of your family or an older adult who uses that. We want to jump in immediately and say, hey, Uncle John, we don't use that word anymore. We use Asian American or members of the Asian American community. Same thing with our friends, with our children and their friends. Those of us who are fortunate enough where our kids still let us drive them around. My son's only 12, so he doesn't have a car, no license. And so when his friends are in the back of the car, I get to kind of hear what they're talking about. And it's really neat. Sometimes they even forget I'm there, at least I think they do. But when you hear things, you want to address them. When you hear insensitivities, because a lot of times kids don't know. And remember, a lot of times kids may be emulating other kids who also don't know. And so we want to give them the tools. Now, the next big part about that real-time interruption is that we're also giving our kids a model to do the same thing. So that when we have our kids who are in that locker room and the boys are just having boy talk or whatever it is, and someone says, oh, that's so gay. Like, you want your son to be able to say, hey, we can't say that anymore. That's not okay.
Yeah.
You want them to be able to have models of you doing that so that they can do that. There was another question that came up in the chat box about Black or African American when recognizing or speaking about people from the Black or African American diaspora. When we use the term African American, I have found that it's not inclusive of all the communities of people who identify as Black. So people who are Caribbean American don't identify as African American. People who are Afro-Latinx don't identify as African American. There were years where I did not use Black in my academic writing, but now I do because it's more inclusive. And so even though African American is certainly apropos in many situations, the term Black captures a larger group of individuals who may be impacted by racism. African American can sometimes leave out an entire group of people who may be impacted by this topic that we don't want to ignore.
That's right. Obama writes about that with his father, right?
Yes,
Who was
yes.
literally from Africa, but not an African American per
That's
se.
right. That's right. That's right. But still a Black man.
That's right. I love the slide where you included the Browndages. I actually saw that couple on Shark Tank last week.
Oh, did you?
They got 4 sharks to support that product. It was so awesome.
I love it. I love it. Actually, Johnson & Johnson Band-Aid brand
Yes.
also just began releasing Band-Aids for that. And those are things that we have to, those are examples that our children would appreciate to understand how racism works, to get that. And if you have kids who are into technology, look up the stories that explain that when the automatic hand washers came out, they weren't created to detect the darkness of my skin. And so Black and brown people would be in the bathrooms with hands covered in soap, but none of the water faucets were cut on for them because the AI technology wasn't set up to register this. Those are stories that mix science and different things with racism and really helps kids have conversations about them. For instance, girls, little Black and brown girls have just been able to get ballet slippers. I didn't even say girls. Little Black, brown boys and girls have just now been able to get ballet shoes that match their skin tones. This is all new. Those are things that you can broach these conversations with children with, where they get it. It's something tangible for them.
That's right. Buy a box of Browndages, I think, if you have a 4-year-old, right?
How about that? That'd be excellent. How fun would that be for families of all different hues to get these Band-Aids and make that a conversation?
Super fun. So, Donald, here's a question that is much in the news for reasons that we kind of hate. How do we explain wokeness to our children? We see this term being used in derogatory ways, whereas we strive to call out social injustice when we see it.
I think it's, again, one of those things that's being weaponized by individuals who want to maintain a particular structure. I tend not to use the word woke anymore because it's being weaponized in that way. we get these kind of catchphrases and it makes it kind of cool and on vogue to do the work. But at the end of the day, we're doing justice work. And if the word woke is going to be a distraction from that, let's eliminate it. Let's not even worry about it anymore. Because we know that whenever individuals attempt to create equity, there's a group of people who experience privilege who are going to see it as oppressive. That's what the research tells us, is that people of privilege see equity work as oppressive. You just got to start moving past it.
Donald, we have about 17 more questions we'd like to ask you. One last question, and then I'm going to ask you for some final comments. This parent asks, I've heard the terms unpacking our baggage, but I'm unsure how to actually do that.
Yeah, there's this great book, and I hope I have it down here. Looks like I do. Yes. This book right here is, for me, one of the greatest examples of unpacking that baggage. The title of the book is called Robert E. Lee and Me, and it's written by this guy who is a professor emeritus at West Point, a scholar in the military. And he was inundated with these thoughts of Robert E. Lee and the South and everything it meant. And he, in this book, Robert E. Lee and Me, goes on a journey of unpacking all of the history that he's been given. And literally, as an adult, looking at those messages that he accepted just automatically and thinking about them in a different way, taking in new information. Remember, I talked about cognitive dissonance at the beginning of this. And one of the things that we have to work on is figuring out where cognitive dissonance points us. Does it point us to change our behaviors, or does it point us to change the truth? And many of us have been changing the truth for a long time. And when we talk about this unpacking our baggage, it's really about being reflective about our histories and the information that we've been given, juxtaposed to contemporary information, and saying, wow, I may have been tricked. They told me that gay people didn't deserve to be married. And I believe that God said that gay people didn't deserve to be married and that they shouldn't adopt children. And then I got new information that says otherwise, and blah, 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 blah. Those are the ways in which we have to be brave enough to own that we've been duped by systems of oppression. And we got to unpack it. We have to.
That's so interesting. Decades ago, I worked at IBM, literally with Robert E. Lee's great-grandson.
Oh, wow.
And we used to call him up just so he'd answer the phone and say, this is Robert E. Lee. But we know a lot more than we did in the 80s.
Yeah.
Donald, there's a question here. I know we might go a minute over, but I think this is really important because you've mentioned it. And maybe we really should do a follow-up event. Writer asks, there's so much anger against critical race theory right now, which is ridiculous. Do you have strategies to explain what CRT is and how it's beneficial to people who might be triggered by this phrase? I believe that might be more than you can answer in 1 minute, but have a whack at it.
Well, it's a great way to close out for today at looking at the weaponization of certain things. The first thing I'll say is that critical race theory is not being taught in anyone's K through 12 school and anywhere in America. It's being used in the same way that somebody asked earlier about the word woke. It's being weaponized in a way to take people into heuristics, right? We talked about these buckets. Critical race theory is another bucket that somebody has created in order to make us think a certain way. What's actually happening in schools is the decolonization or the end of revisionism. That whole slide that I had about Christopher Columbus, that's what's happening in schools. That's not critical race theory. And those are the things that we want people to understand. Yeah, I want people to know what critical race theory is, know how people study it in law school, understand how it speaks directly to the disparate and disproportionate practices that result in disparities based on race in the legal system. But nobody's fourth grader is learning about critical race theory. They are, however, learning that Christopher Columbus infected blankets intentionally with smallpox and gave it to indigenous people for them to die from. They are learning that the first type of biological warfare was that. But that's not critical race theory. That's just being honest about American history in spite of how much it hurts. So the response is, let the people know none of your kids are learning critical race theory. They're just learning what actually happened on this land so that they can work better to create a better future.
Oh, wow. Well, Donald, we have so many comments coming in with people really grateful for this conversation. This was not maybe the simple talk about what to say to your kids. We can do more of that, but I think you've given us an incredible foundation. We are so grateful. Any final words for us tonight, other than just us saying thank you to you?
Well, thank you to both you and all the school districts and healthcare organizations that support this work, because if we want to create a healthy future for our kids, it's not just about a script to have a conversation. It's really about a sustainable process that puts you in a position to be your child's expert. An expert in this situation doesn't mean that you have a PhD in race and racism. What it means is that you create a brave environment where your kid will come to you first before they believe things off the street. And that's what we want. We want parents who are prepared, not with all the right answers, but knowing how to be a resource for their child and open the door for these discussions. That's what we want.
Thank you so much, Dr. Donald Grant. The next talk is going to be called Creating a Brave Environment. I love that so much. So again, thank you to everyone who is with us tonight for your wonderful questions and comments and support. This is why we do this work, to try to make a difference and give you the tools that you need to raise happier, healthier, thriving kids. So again, thank you so much, Donald Grant, for everything tonight. And thank you everybody for being with us. Good night, everybody. Take care. This video will be available soon on our video library. And we have an entire band of videos under social justice. You can find other talks from Dr. Grant on the video library. Again, thank you, everybody. Hope you take a minute to fill out that survey. Take care, stay healthy, and see you soon. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.